Hello, beautiful people. Welcome to my channel. My name is Sue on Chat to Sue, a channel where we talk about stuff that we really need to talk about. Let me put a disclaimer. Today's topic is very heavy, and if you feel triggered, I have placed places where you can go to seek help. We're talking about emotional abuse. What is emotional abuse? Emotional abuse is when one is being gaslighted, intimidated, belittled. So somebody will use their words to destroy you. That's basically it, you know. And the problem is we do these things to our children. They're yelling, they're screaming, they're kissing, you know. But it goes deep when the child becomes an adult, right? Because they were yelling and screaming, and because that in when they were young, guess what? They repeat the same pattern, right? But anyway, I've got Dr. Ramani here to explain more, and yeah, let's hear what she says.
Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani here. So let's talk a little bit about verbal abuse in childhood and what it does to a kid. Because you might think to yourself, well, do you really need to do research to figure out that verbal abuse is not good for a child? No, but a group of people did, and I think what they found really matters, and it really matters for us to understand how narcissistic parents can affect children. This is a big week for me to read a lot of literature this week, and I was reading a very interesting research study that was conducted by Shanta Dubé and her colleagues at a place called Wingate University. And in this study, they did something called a meta-analysis, and they reviewed lots of studies about childhood verbal abuse, a child being verbally abused by a parent, caregiver, even a teacher. I was drawn to read the article because it's such a universal pattern in people who have antagonistic, narcissistic parents in childhood, right? And the authors were really focused on making a very interesting distinction. They wanted to treat childhood verbal abuse as something that's a part of, but distinct from childhood emotional abuse. And they were clear to point out that childhood emotional abuse is almost like a much bigger umbrella that takes in more territory, but it includes other things like the silent treatment, neglect, a child being raised in a home in which they're exposed to domestic violence, indifference, a parent simply just not caring about them, right? Childhood verbal abuse is obviously a huge part of that whole larger childhood emotional abuse pie. The screaming, the humiliating, the use of exploitative language, manipulative language, scapegoating language. Again, enough of you who had narcissistic parents survived this to know what that part of it is. So the people who did this research find that the long-term effects of this childhood verbal abuse include depression, anxiety, in some cases PTSD, a greater risk of problematic substance use, and even suicidal thoughts. So the verbal abuse in childhood, they were able to show across these many, many studies, can harm a person's mental health well into adulthood. And given the severity, depends on how severe the verbal abuse was, some folks may even experience fallout consistent with complex trauma. Now, by and large, when people have antagonistic or narcissistic parents, the downstream effect in adulthood is most prominently negative mood states such as anxiety or depression. Now, interestingly, according to the research at large, they pointed out something that this was quite telling to me. They pointed out that the World Health Organization found that physical and sexual abuse rates have fallen, while rates of emotional abuse have increased. And this is probably a combination of greater enforcement of reporting laws around abuse, greater consequence for people who abuse children, and more overall awareness. The realist in me would say that people are still abusing their children and finding a way to do it that's less easy to pin down and then get reported on. The emotional abuse, instead of in ways that it doesn't leave as many observable scars, I would argue that kids are still being abused as much as they always were. Almost none of this research ever examines, though, the personalities of the parents. They will document that a child was abused and understandably focus on the child, the well-being and the outcomes of the child. So we can't make a definitive statement that a certain percent of people who harm a child also have an antagonistic personality. We know it's multi-determined who abuses a child, with factors contributing to this kind of behavior, including stuff like the parent's own history of trauma, the parent's own history of being abused by their parents and caregivers, even cultural norms about parenting, things like alcohol and drug use, social causes like poverty, and the stresses associated with all of these things, right? All of that said, what we do know about anything is personality is a constant drumbeat that sounds under behavior. I sincerely hope someone does the research. This is not easy research to do, to think about parental personality. But I would guess if someone did do the research, that a significant proportion, if not the majority, of parents and caregivers who chronically abuse children likely do have some form of antagonistic personality, dysregulated, entitled, unempathic, exploitative, manipulative, blame-shifting. It tracks. And if that's the case, it also makes the case that having an antagonistic parent would not be good for a child's health, because antagonistic parents, yes, and narcissistic parents, are far more likely to verbally abuse their children. And that means the long-term effects in those children as they come into adulthood that these researchers were finding in their exploration of all of these studies. Now, where the article sort of lost me, and I understand from a science perspective why they have to say this, because they have to be able to, the work has to apply into other situations, is to take what they have learned about childhood verbal abuse, this thing that it's a thing and it's not good for children and ultimately not good for those children when they become adults. And one thing that these authors say is, like, we have to address primary prevention. We have to stop verbal abuse from happening in the first place. And that means that the adults, the parents, the caregivers, need to stop yelling at the kids. Can that realistically happen? One could argue, well, hey, the rates of other forms of abuse drop, so why not? Well, it's complicated to figure out why the rates of those other forms of abuse dropped and the other emotional abuse increased. But again, abusers are going to abuse, especially when they're antagonistic. That's not going to change. And emotional abuse and verbal abuse are all but impossible to legally punish. If the definition of child abuse were expanded to include verbal and emotional abuse, the courts, law enforcement, child services, and social services would literally have to hire thousands and thousands more people to manage what would come their way. It's not realistic, and it's never going to happen. Certainly, a subset of parents who may not be antagonistic could be trained and taught to dial down the emotional abuse if they were less stressed, had more support, more resources, more help. Where the hell those resources are going to come from? That's never going to happen. So let's keep it real. There's really no pathway here. Some people talk about parent training, teaching parents that yelling at their kids is not okay, and teaching the parents other responses. That might help in some percentage of cases, but you got to get those parents into the training. But when we sift out to the narcissistic and antagonistic parents, there's no training, there are no resources, there are no supports, other than someone else coming along and fully taking responsibility for raising the children, that will fix it. We know that these personality styles are very resistant to change. They're also very reactive when the person is stressed. And it may simply be that the consequence of other forms of abuse, like, for example, being punished and all those other things would happen if a parent engaged in physical violence, but those antagonistic parents are still engaging in the emotional and verbal violence. which carry the harms of all abuse and violence. And that's the rub. Antagonism and parenting do not mix. The requirements of parenting, eternal patience, self-sacrifice, chronically putting another person's needs before your own, constant compromise, and very high levels of self-regulation are literally impossible for a narcissistic person. I really commend the researchers on this article. It was a very important one. It's one that I am going to keep as a reference, and we'll put a link to a summary of it in the video notes if it's something you want to read further and learn more about. If you're a therapist, this article should be required reading. And teasing out the separate effects of verbal abuse is important. Emotional abuse is, in fact, a very big umbrella that takes in a lot of territory. But when it comes down to it, we cannot talk about verbal abuse, and frankly, any form of abuse of children, without talking about antagonism or narcissism. Because it is often a reason why so many of the family violence prevention interventions may not always work, especially when it comes to emotional abuse. Simply attempting to teach antagonistic and narcissistic parents to better regulate their emotions is not something that is ever going to happen at a population scale. Antagonistic, narcissistic parents fully overtake and overwhelm their children. They view their kids as either someone that should never inconvenience them or make them look good, or that is there to attend to the parents' needs. And when that child ever expresses their own needs, wants, hopes, interests, true selves, the narcissistic parent will either shut it down or respond to it variably. For example, show interest and then pull away when they can't be bothered. Or they may say things that will leave the child feeling as though that they're the one, the child themselves is the one who's entitled and demanding and out of line. The verbal abuse is a subsection of the larger landscape of what happens to children in these sorts of personality environments. And the lifetime of self-doubt, self-blame, confusion that follow all of this is part of that too. And keep in mind that the parents don't just have no effect just because you got older. Narcissistic parents may keep up with their problematic behavior for a lifetime. And while you have different options and recourse when you're an adult, inside all of us is a child when we do encounter an invalidating parent, no matter what age we are. And that verbal abuse that scared us as kids still bruises us as adults. We hold it in our bodies and magnifies the likelihood of lots of poor outcomes. Listen, this research in many ways is telling most of us something we probably already knew, especially if you survived a childhood like this. But the more research that gets done on this, each day we may get a little bit closer to an attempt to try to address these things at a larger level. But it also means that we have to have the will to also account for the impacts of personality on these findings. And to me, that's really the next innovative horizon in this kind of work. And that's another science moment on this channel. I'll keep the science coming. I'm sort of doing some research and really digging into it. A lot of it really is worth sharing. And one last thing, I wanted to let you know something exciting. I have a new book coming out in February called It's Not You. Very relevant even what was talked about in this video if you grew up with a narcissistic parent. It's available for pre-order now. Click the link in the video description to check it out. It takes on all kinds of narcissistic relationship, and this book is about healing. Thanks again.
There you go. We had. Please just have a calm and proper conversation with your kids. No yelling and screaming. Just talk, you know. And if you feel triggered in any way, seek help. Don't project your emotions to your kids. Right? Thank you for those who subscribe. I'm grateful. Please like, share, and subscribe. I'm sending you so much love, healing, and light. Till we meet again. Have a beautiful day. Bye-bye.